Hey guys, what is up and welcome back to the channel. This is my full and complete setup guide for RPCS3, an awesome emulator for the PlayStation 3. This guide is going to give you all of the best settings for max compatibility on many of your favorite PlayStation 3 emulated games, including every single tip and trick for getting the max possible performance out of each of these titles. I'm going to be showing you how to download and install the very latest updates for your games in this emulator, as well as showing you how to unlock the performance potential of many games like Persona 5, Demon's Souls and Red Dead Redemption to allow you to play them at unlocked 60 frames per second and well above. There's a hell of a lot to cover in this video, so let's jump straight across to my desktop and get things started. Okay, so first things first, we are going to be coming to this address, rpcs3.net, the official website for this PlayStation 3 emulator. It's a very useful website, you should definitely check it out, it has lots of features. For now though, we're going to be clicking this download button to bring us to the download page for all of the latest builds for both Windows and Linux. However, this video is going to be concentrating on the Windows version of RPCS3, so for now, simply click here and begin downloading the latest build. Let's save this to our desktop for now. While that file's downloading, we're going to come to this link, yet another one you'll find in the description, and we are going to be downloading the very latest firmware for the PlayStation 3. This is required for the full usage of this emulator. Again, save this to your desktop. This firmware file is actually quite a bit larger than the emulator build itself, so we'll just have to wait a few more moments for it to complete downloading. Once it is downloaded, we can close our browser as we have all of our required files now. So here we have our actual build, and here we have our firmware file. Next, what we need to do is right click our build and using 7-zip select extract to its own folder. This is our RPCS3 build. For now, I'm going to be renaming this RPCS3. Once I've done this, I'm going to open it up and I'm going to drag and drop my firmware file into this folder. Now before we go any further, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to close this folder and I'm going to move it to a different drive away from my desktop. The reason I'm doing this is because I do not want to clutter up my operating system drive, so for now I'm going to be storing this on my eDisk or my eDrive. All I'm going to do is right click, select cut and paste this to this location. As I said, the main reason we are doing this is to save the storage space on our main operating system drive, as this RPCS3 folder can actually get quite large once you have DLCs and updates installed. Next, come back to this RPCS3 folder and we're going to drag and drop this to our taskbar, creating a handy and easy to use shortcut for launching this emulator whenever we need it. As you'll see, when I launch it, this is the emulator we have just installed. For now, we are going to be basically bypassing this welcome message. You're going to click this box here, and then click continue. The first thing you are going to be doing every time you use this emulator is you're going to install its firmware, so let's do that now. When you click install firmware, it's going to open up this RPCS3 folder. Simply select the firmware file which we previously downloaded. This process can take a few minutes depending on the power and speed of your CPU, so just click this don't show again button, click OK, then we're going to have to wait for our PPU modules to fully compile. And there we go, now that that is completed, we can continue and actually start adding some games to our games list area. To do this, you're going to come to File, Add Games, then navigate to wherever on your drive you have your dumped or downloaded games. The layout of most of these games is going to be similar to this. For example, for Asura's Wrath, you're going to find a PS3 game and a PS3 update folder. The game folder is by far the most important component. So instead of selecting these games individually like some guides recommend, all you have to do is select the folder in which all of these games are stored. Once I do this, you're going to see all of my games pop up like so. Now you can see all of these different tabs at the top. If you actually right click in this area, you can actually enable or disable any of these different sections, and you can also individually click each section to filter your games list either by version, name, serial number or whatever you want. You can also swap to this grid view, which is actually my preferred view for any of these different game titles, as I think it looks very nice and clean. Now, some games I have in my games folder aren't actually added yet. This is because I have deliberately separated them into separate folders. For example, if I scroll down, you're going to see my Persona 5, which was sent to me by a very keen fan of the channel, Emmett. So thank you very much for sending me that game disc. Again, all I need to do is select and highlight this folder, click select folder, and there we go. Persona 5 is now showing up properly in my RPCS3 games list. Now, before we delve into specific settings for games, I'm going to show you how you can download and update your games to their very latest versions or their most compatible versions. By swapping over to this list view, you can see that RPCS3 tells you if you have an update available for your game and what the latest update is. In the description of this video, you will find this download zip file. All you're going to be doing is downloading it, and you're going to be extracting it to a folder of its own. We're done with this zip file, so I'm just going to move it off screen. Next, let's bring this folder to center and open it up. First thing you want to do is to run this file. It's going to install the VB runtime. Once it installs, just click OK. Next, we're going to be actually installing the application that's going to be downloading our update files for us. To do that, simply launch this installer and follow the normal installation process you would with absolutely any program. Once it completes, you're just going to get this little shortcut on your desktop, and since I want to run it right now, I'm just going to finish and get the program to auto run. There we go, we now have this application for downloading our updates. Let's take a look at how we can find out exactly what the latest update is for our specific game. By opening up our RPCS3 user interface, you can see that we have individual serial codes here. For Asura's Wrath, its latest version is 1.02, so just right click, come down to copy info, select copy serial, then come back to PS3 game updates, paste that serial into this title ID section. You can see Asura's Wrath pops up, click verify, and it is going to find the latest update file for you. Make sure that your custom firmware or firmware is selected here. Make sure it's the very latest 4.55 or whatever is the newest. Click verify again, and you can see this file is now ready to download. All you want to do is click on it, right click and select download. It's then going to have a progress bar, and we'll need to wait for that to finish. Once downloaded, right click again, select download. This will then bring you to the location of the PKG or update file we're going to be installing in the emulator. What I like to do is I like to come to this download section and pin this to quick access. This is going to make it really easy to access any of these downloaded files since this folder will be right here. Next, come back to RPCS3, come to File, Install PKG. Once your Explorer window opens, scroll back up to Quick Access, select Downloads, select your Asura's Wrath or whichever file you have downloaded, select the PKG, click Open, and the emulator is going to install that file. There you go, you can see Asura's Wrath is now updated to its latest version. This is exactly what you can do with any game, and while not all games are compatible on their latest updates, for example, Gran Turismo 5 is most compatible on update version 1.05. Now, the way in which certain PS3 games have to be updated is a little strange, as you actually have to install some update files one after another. For example, with Gran Turismo 5, I'm going to paste the title ID here, click verify, and you can see here that I have already downloaded all of the updates required to get version 1.05 installed. Basically, what you need to do is download all of these updates up till the 1.05 update, and then you're going to need to install them sequentially in the emulator. Again, I'm going to come to Install PKG, come to Gran Turismo 5, and you're going to need to install these files one after another from top to bottom. Now, usually the very first update for a game is quite large. This is very true for Gran Turismo 5, so it can take a few moments to install in the emulator, but it's usually the case that the following updates are quite small and should basically install instantly. Again, all I want to do is come back to File, Install PKG, install the next update, select OK. You can see that one installed very quick. Again, install the next one, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. Gran Turismo 5, as I said, is most compatible on update 1.05, but to be honest, most games are compatible on their very latest update, so you should just try to install those updates, and if you're having any issues with game compatibility, simply ask either on my Discord or over on the RPCS3 Discord what is the most compatible update for your specific game you're trying to play. This PS3 game updates program is definitely a handy one, and considering that these update files are free to download download from Sony, there are absolutely no issues in using it. For now though, let's move on to some game and emulator specific settings. First of all, I'm going to be showing you the best settings for Persona. Now, while I could just right click and use a custom configuration, what I first want to do is get you to set up some actual global configuration settings for the emulator. To do this, come to configuration in the top section and open CPU. Now, one thing I do want to make very clear in this video is that if you're not using a Ryzen CPU, do not enable this enable thread scheduler option. So if you have an Intel CPU, do not enable this. It is only for Ryzen CPUs. Since I am using a 3700X in this video, I'm going to leave it enabled. For most games, there's no other settings you need to change. Coming across the GPU though, we are going to be changing this from OpenGL to Vulkan, since this is by far the most compatible API for this emulator. These settings are pretty much rock solid defaults. The only other thing you could possibly change here are the GUIs or the actual look of the emulator itself. Most of these themes were made by key contributors to the RPCS3 project, and many of them are absolutely stunning looking. My favourites, I would have to say, by far are probably the two Skyline ones. For example, I really like the Skyline light theme, though to be honest, for a video like this, it might look a little bit too weird and too bright. Now, you can just set this back to the normal theme by just selecting none and hitting apply, but to be honest, I'm not a massive fan of this overly bright theme, so I'm going to swap back to one of my favourites, which is the Skyline Nightfall theme. It's just a really nice and stylized user interface. To save this, click save, and there you go, you can see your theme has now been correctly applied and saved. For now, let's move back to Persona 5 and I'm going to show you the best settings for this game. As you can see, our global defaults have been applied, so we've been automatically changed from OpenGL to Vulkan. Coming back to the CPU tab though, the only thing we really need to change here is preferred SPU threads. For most games, this is going to work best at auto, but for Persona 5, you are more than likely going to get the best performance by setting it to 2 or 3, and you'll also get much better performance by setting SPU block size to Mega. If your CPU supports TSX, you should also enable it here. And again, as I said earlier on, if you are not using a Ryzen CPU, remember to turn off Enable Thread Scheduler. For now though, let's move back to GPU. In this tab, we're already set to Vulkan, and if you have a CPU with a lot of cores, for example 6, 8 or 12 cores, you should turn on multi-threaded RSX, as it can give you a very nice performance boost in many games. Now, for resolution in any game on this emulator, you do not want to touch the top default resolution. You want to use the resolution scale. You can see here by turning it to 300%, I am going to be setting this to 3840 by 2160 or 4K resolution. You should also set anisotropic filtering to 16x in pretty much every single game, and since I'm going to be showing you how to install the 60 FPS mod, we're going to set our frame limit to 60. For the most part, in most games, you're not also going to be touching this resolution scale threshold, so just leave this at its default setting. For now, I'm going to click the save button in the bottom left hand corner, and for now I'm going to show you how to activate some additional settings that are actually hidden within the emulator. To access these settings, come back to your RPCS3 folder, come to GUI configs, and you are looking for this current settings.ini. Once you open this in Notepad or whatever editor you have, you're going to see this meta section, and you should see show debug tab, and it is going to be automatically set to false. You basically just want to set this to true instead of false, click file, save, and once you have this applied, you can close the Notepad document. Next, you want to rerun the emulator, and when you right click on your game again, come back to configure, you can now see that we have this additional debug section. Many users of this emulator seem to report that they get much better performance in games like Persona 5, Red Dead Redemption and Demon's Souls by turning on this use GPU texture scaling setting. Personally, I haven't seen any performance improvements when using it, but for anyone with a lower end system, I would advise turning it on, checking it out and seeing if it improves your performance. We now also have access to this maximum number of spurs threads section. Usually this is defaulted to unlimited, but you can get drastically better performance by setting this to a lower value like 4, 5 or 3. If you, like myself, have a CPU with a lot of cores, I would still advise you to set this to unlimited. Now, we also have access to a VBlank and clock scale, and we're not going to be using this for Persona 5, but we will be revisiting it a little bit later on for games like Demon Souls. For now though, click Save in the bottom left hand corner to save your settings. For now, we're going to be launching Persona 5 for the very first time. As with when we installed our firmware, we are going to have to compile our PPU modules for each individual game, and as with the firmware installation, this process can take quite a few minutes depending on the power of your system. Once your PPU modules have compiled, Persona 5 is going to begin installing all of its game data into your RPCS3 folder. It is very, very important that you do not skip or close the emulator while this process is happening. If you do, it may corrupt some of the game files which are getting installed to the emulator, so as I said, please just be patient and wait for this process to finish. Once it is completed, you should see your game frame rate appear up here, you should start to compile shaders, and you know that everything is working so far. However, we don't want to play Persona 5 at just 30 frames per second, so let's close the game, tick this little box, select yes, and get the 60 FPS mod installed. In the description of this video, you will find this patch.yml in a downloadable format. This patch.yml file contains many modifications for Persona 5, most importantly the portrait fix that fixes the game's portrait images when you're upscaling the game, and again, as I said, the 60 frames per second mod. This mod is the most up-to-date version of it, and also when we scroll down to the bottom section here, you can see that this patch also includes the 60 frames per second mod for Demon Souls, which we'll be taking a look at later. However, for Persona 5 and any of these mods to even work, you are going to need to acquire the PPU exe for your game, and you're also going to need to install one mod. This mod file can be found in a downloadable form down in this description again. All you need to do is download this zip file, and again using 7-zip extract it to a folder of its own. When you open up the folder, you're going to find this mod.cpk file. To install this mod, all you need to do is right click Persona 5, select Open Install Folder in this list right here, and to show you exactly what I'm doing with the most clarity possible, I'm just going to separate these two windows. This mod.cpk folder needs to go into this folder right here, the user dir. All that you need to do is drag and drop this mod file over into this user dir folder. I already had mine installed, but this is exactly what you need to do. Just drag and drop it into that directory. Once you have that done, the mod is basically installed. All that we now need to do is find the actual PPU exe of our game. To find this, you simply want to right click in this log or TTY area and select Trace. Once Trace is selected, you once again need to run Persona 5. Unlike the very first time we ran the game, this should speed right through your PPU module compilation, and as you can see in the top left hand corner, we are still running at 30 frames per second. Once your game gets to this Thieves Guild screen, you're just going to close the game window and then come back down to this section right here. All you want to do is click into this section, then hit the Control key and the F key at the same time. This is going to bring up this window. Into it, you want to type PPU space exe. This is going to show you your PPU executable for Persona 5 and any game that may require it. All you need to do is highlight the PPU exe like this. Please make sure to not grab any spaces, only get the actual letters themselves. Once highlighted, right click and select copy. Now that we have this PPU exe, we can come back to our previously downloaded patch file, scroll down to near the bottom, and right here where you see this PPU, this is where you need to paste that executable that you just copied. All you need to do is highlight, then right click and select paste. Basically, all you need to do is make sure that this PPU right here matches the one that showed up in the trace field within the emulator. That's literally all you need to do. There is simply one final step for installing this patch on the emulator. Again, make sure to hit File, click Save, and then close this document. There is one last step, adding the patch file to your actual RPCS3 directory. Before adding any patch files to this directory, we're going to have to kill any instances of the emulator that are running, then simply drag and drop this patch.yml file so that it sits directly beside or in the main RPCS3 directory. Once you've done this, the 60 frames per second mod and portrait fixes are completely and totally installed. If you want, you can swap this section back from trace to success, though to be honest, it doesn't really matter. Now, for Persona 5, there is actually one sneaky little secret setting that can significantly boost your performance. Basically, what you need to do is right-click Persona 5 in your games list, just like so. Then you're going to be selecting Open Custom Config folder using this option right here. Once you do this, it's going to highlight this folder like so. All you want to do is open this .yml file. The setting you are looking for is approximate xfloat. This setting can actually drop your performance quite a bit. In my experience, I lose about 4 to 5 frames per second, though on my 4670K system I lose about 7 by having this set to true. All you need to do is set this from true to false, and then you need to click File at the very top of this section again and make sure to click Save so it saves your settings. In my experimenting so far, I haven't found any other games that can benefit from turning approximate xfloat off, though if you wish to do so, you should definitely experiment with other games to see if you can reap the benefits of performance just like Persona 5 can. For now, let's double click our game in the games list and actually get it booting at 4K 60 FPS with all of these graphical fixes added. Now, since we've installed that mod, we are going to be compiling just a few more PPU modules, but it's not really anything to worry about, and you can now see that our game is indeed running at 60 frames per second in the top left hand corner. Now, even though we have all our mods set up and the game running really well, there is one thing we need to do before we can run any games: set up our actual controls. To do this, click this pads section at the very top, and the most important section for picking your controller is this handler drop down window. So you have the option of null, keyboard, DS3, DS4, X input, or MM joystick. Most people are going to use keyboard, DualShock 3 or DualShock 4 if they have it, but I would say the most popular will be X input. I myself use a DualShock 4 controller, and as you can see, when I select it, my DS4 controller is shown down here. You can also see in the dead zone setting and when I move either of my triggers that this controller is being successfully detected and used. Now, if you're using another controller, for example, very popular ones like the Xbox 360 or Xbox One, you're going to be using X input, and you are basically going to just need to set up all of your controller maps based on the image you can see in center screen. It's very easy to do this, so please just set up your controller button maps as you would like. Now, you also have access to analog dead zones. These can dramatically help if the analog sticks on your controller have partial or extreme drift. Basically, you just want to make sure that this little blue dot or whatever color it is always inside of the red circle, and to be honest, if your drift or analog stick issues are as bad as you can see on screen right now, I would advise you to either clean, repair, or just replace your controller. Since my controller doesn't really have any drift issues, I'm just going to make these as small as I can possibly make them, keeping the dot inside the circle. And before we finish, let's take a look at a few additional settings here. Now, as well as just using the standard pad, you can also use the Guitar Hero guitar, drums, DJ Hero, DJ set, and also the dance mat from, I believe, Dance Dance Revolution or something similar like that. For the most part, you're just going to be using the standard pad, and the DS4 controllers also have control over their LEDs. You also obviously have control over your vibration motors, but for the most part, we're just going to be hitting save and just continuing through gameplay. Now that we have controllers set up, we can actually launch into Persona 5. I'm basically just going to speed through this gameplay footage, get us into gameplay, and show you that we are indeed running at 4K 60 frames per second. And there we go. After our initial bit of shader caching stutter once loading into game, you can indeed see that in the top left hand corner we are running at 60 frames per second, and the game looks absolutely beautiful. Now that we're done with setting up Persona 5, let's move on to another few popular games, for example Red Dead Redemption and Demon's Souls. First of all, we're going to be taking a look at Demon's Souls since we already have a patch file in our folder for it. Again, what you're going to do is right click and come to configure. Now, basically, we're just going to be using the exact same defaults that we set up in the configuration menu earlier on. We're going to be using preferred SPU threads of auto, and we're going to be setting our SPU block size to mega. As I've mentioned 3 times in this video already, if you're not using a Ryzen CPU, disable enable thread scheduler. Moving across to the GPU tab, again, we're going to be using Vulkan, and as with Persona 5, I'm also going to turn my resolution up to 3840 by 2160, or 4K resolution as you may know it. Now, usually Demon's Souls requires you to use right color buffers, but due to the patch file which we previously added, it has a nice little workaround that allows you to not use choose this setting and gain about 20 to 30% extra performance. Now, in order to use this patch file, we're again going to have to close out of the emulator and reopen the patch.yml, which is inside of our RPCS3 folder. For Demon Souls, we're going to be scrolling down to this bottom section here, and you can see this is the 1.0.1 version of the patch, which was created by WhatCookie. The two versions of the game which are supported by this 60 or 120 FPS patch are the BLUS 30443, and if I open up my emulator again, right click and come to the configure window, you can see that this is the exact version that I am using. Now, it's not the only version that is also supported. You can see that the BLES00932 version is also fully supported, so if you have either of these game versions, they are going to work absolutely flawlessly. Now, in this patch folder, if you want to activate this workaround that makes you not need to use right color buffers and also boost your performance, you just want to delete this hash or a pound key before this line, and while you can play this game at 120 frames per second, I would highly advise only playing it at 60, since at 120 the physics are pretty damn wonky. Just leave the lines exactly as you can see them, click File, Save, and we're going to be closing this patch.yml. To continue, reload the emulator again. Now, the next thing I like to do, since I haven't actually launched Demon Souls on this installation of RPCS3, is to just run the game for the first time before changing any VBlank or clock scale settings. In the past, when I installed this 60 frames per second mod using both the patch and then changing its VBlank and clock scale, the game would basically just hang, freeze, and not load into gameplay if I used the 60 frames per second mode before launching the game in its original mode. Now, this may not happen to everyone, but for myself personally, this is what I do every time. Before loading a game or installing any patches for 60 frames per second mods or boosting your games to 60 frames per second, just load it in its stock configuration first, then close it and turn on all of the bells, whistles, and 60 frames per second mods that your heart desires. And there we go, we have our Demon Souls logo. We're going to get our first menu pop up, and you can see in the top left hand corner we're running at 30 frames per second. Now that it's loaded for the first time and we've compiled all of our PPU modules, right click Demon Souls in the games list, come to configure, then come across to the advanced tab. That is, of course, once you've already applied the settings that I've shown you already. So come to the advanced tab, and for this VBlank setting, you're going to be setting this to 120. Make sure to set it to exactly 120 and then change your clock scale to 200%. Just in case you changed any settings before, please also make sure that you are using use sleep only for sleep timer accuracy. Again, remember to hit save in the bottom left hand corner. You can then reload your game, and we're going to see that we're running at 60 frames per second. There we go, there's our Demon Souls logo, and we are indeed running at 60. As before with Persona 5, I'm not going to waste your time with loading screens. Let's get straight into gameplay and see how it's running. Now, graphics are going to be very funky when you load into any of this game's levels, first of all, but as you can see, we are running at an absolutely perfectly smooth 4K 60 frames per second in this absolutely unbelievable title. If you've never played it before, I would definitely say give it a try, especially so if you're a fan of the Dark Souls series. This game is absolutely and truly amazing. So now that we're done with Demon Souls, let's move on to our next title, yet another very popular game on this emulator, Red Dead Redemption. As before, we're going to have to come to our game in the games list, right click it as always, and come to configure. Once we're in the configuration window, there is not much to change since we already set up our global defaults. We're just going to be changing SPU block size to Mega, and if you have access to the TSS instruction on your Intel CPU, make sure to turn it on. Coming across to GPU, there is a bit to change here. I'm going to set my frame limit to 60 since we're going to be running this game at an unlocked 60 frames per second, and isotropic filtering should be set to 16x, and since this game is a lot more demanding and a lot less optimized than other games like Persona 5 and Demon Souls, I'm only going to run it at a resolution of 2560 by 1440 or 1440p. As I said, we're going to be unlocking this game to 60 frames per second, so let's do that now before we go any further. To do this, all you need to edit here is the VBlank frequency. For Red Dead Redemption, you should not touch the clock scale. All you need to do is set VBlank to 120 Hz. Coming across to Emulator, there's nothing we need to change here, but in this debug tab, you could potentially get some extra performance by enabling the Use GPU Texture Scaling setting. As I said before, this setting doesn't really do too much for me, but you should definitely experiment with it and see if it helps you out. Now, Red Dead Redemption can get a nice little performance boost by using a multi-threaded RSX, but at least at time of making this video, it also introduces a lot of graphical bugs. Red Dead Redemption also requires you to turn on right color buffers. If you don't, at night time, all of your lighting is just going to be completely broke. Now, another thing you can turn off for some additional performance is the MSAA or anti-aliasing in this game. Personally, on my own system, I get between a 3 and 4 frames per second boost by setting this to disabled, so if you're looking for the best possible frame rates, just leave it at disabled. If not, leave it at auto. For Red Dead Redemption, these are all of the most optimal settings. Once you have them all set, hit the save button and we are now ready to load another game. As with Persona 5 and Demon's Souls, it's going to take a long time for your PPU cache to properly compile, and as before, as I did with those games also, I'm just going to skip through this process since you've seen it all before and get us into some actual gameplay. In typical fashion, when you load into a game for the very first time, in your bottom left hand corner you're going to see constant compiling shaders, and your game is going to from time to time look very buggy and play very sluggishly. As in many other modern emulators like Cemu or Yuzu, the more you play your game, the less stuttery and laggy it will become. This is simply the process of building your shader cache. For now, you guys are probably as sick of seeing this cutscene as I am, so let's skip it and get into some gameplay at the train station in Armadillo. And there we go, we're back into gameplay. You can see my frame rate usually stabilizes in and around 16 frames per second when I'm recording using my CPU like this. Usually I would get probably about 3, 4 or maybe 5 frames per second higher in Armadillo. You can also see that when I look out here towards the desert or look down at the ground, my game is indeed going past 30 frames per second. It is properly now unlocked to a 60 frames per second title. Now, obviously, in the current optimization state of RPCS3, it is in no way possible to maintain a constant locked 60 frames per second in this game, but to be honest, even at frame rates over 15 frames per second, I really would say that this game is very playable. To be honest, in respect to settings for this emulator, I have pretty much shown you absolutely anything you can or would need to change to get the best possible compatibility out of most titles. As always, if there are any issues with any games you're having on this emulator, do not be afraid to ask in either my Discord or over on the official RPCS3 Discord. Links to both of those can be found down in this video's description. I know this guide was a little bit longer than the ones I usually make, but RPCS3 has a hell of a lot more settings than most of the emulators I cover, so I wanted to go into the added and extra detail to make sure that all of you guys have all of the best and most optimized settings for these titles. As always, if you have any questions about anything covered in this video, do not be afraid to ask in the comments section down below. For now though, that's going to be it for this complete RPCS3 setup guide. Once again guys, thank you very much for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to leave a like down below. These likes really do help with the visibility of this video and also of my YouTube channel as a whole. And if you would like to see all of my future videos, please also consider subscribing. Once again guys, thank you very much for watching. Have a great day and I will see you all in the next one.